And happy Monday, everyone. David Cross here again. I hope everybody had a great weekend and that you had some downtime, spent some time with your family, friends, doing hobbies, whatever it was. I did and had a great time this weekend and also had been busy. And so I wanted to share part two of the PowerShell MAC address vendor lookup. And I think where I had left off last, if we kind of remember, we had finished up a script that allowed us to call, which we called get MAC vendor, that allowed us to pass either a series of MAC addresses and or telling it that we were going to do a MAC search or a vendor search. So we had the ability to specify what type of search we had. And then if you recall, it was going out and checking this OUI.txt file that is from the IEEE, the standards, IEEE standards, and it downloaded, checked the date, and if it was a valid file, it processed it by pulling out a whole bunch of base 16 addresses, MAC addresses, that I could then look up, and it was doing a local lookup. So effectively what we had is I was piping in all these MACs. It would take about a minute to process, 35 seconds or so for 20, and it would finish up the results. And so where I wanted to go with this particular function and this video in specific was to kind of introduce 2 or 3 new processes here. And one of those was to upload this MAC address data into a database that was going to be running on our Node-RED. So first of all, having that ability to query from a database in some structure that made it simpler to pull the data and to query and search. And also performance, so that handled both of those in the same time. And then also where I could introduce new APIs that could query a single or multiple MAC addresses, a single vendor, multiple vendors. And then having different way of doing that, one through a get URL, one through a post where you're doing multiple uploads. So I decided, well, I think I'm going to go do that. So here's what I ended up with, and I'm just going to go ahead and show you real quick. I wrote up a couple of APIs on Node-RED, which I'm going to go into. But I'm going to run this to be very quick. So when I run this, it's now doing the same process it had done with the local lookups of these MAC addresses that I had already in a variable called MAC input. And that MAC input was derived from some ARP information that I ran on my client. And so really any kind of ARP client, which you'll see here, is just telling it to ARP it, select a pattern string for each of those, replace strings and stuff with an empty space, and then return it. And so this was generating that MAC input. And so the idea was that we wanted to look this up. It would look up what it could and drop everything else. Well, that was pretty slow to do it through file, but again, I'll run this for you. When I run it this way, it's very fast. So let me kind of show you how I got to this point and where I started with, because we're going to I think I'll have maybe 2 videos out of this, because we need to do something with the vendors, because I've really only concentrated on the MAC addresses right now, but some of this we can use, but we're going to move into it more. So here's a good point to, let me take a long breath there. Here's a good point to go ahead and introduce some Node-RED, and within the Node-RED, talk about SqlLite, which is one of the nodes that are available through the palette, and as a caveat to this, that it's available as a palette on Linux and Windows through the standard Node-RED installation. However, if you're using a vendor or a cloud version of this, make sure it's available through that product line or platform. So I have, and I installed the SqlLite. And so in the SqlLite, in your palettes, which is where you want to take a look at it, you should have the manage palette if you have that capability. And you can do a search for SQL. I have my SQL already, but there is a node-led SqlLite, which I chose, which seemed easy to work with. Now this node, once that's installed, it should appear up under your storage, and actually we could just do a SQL, and you'll see under your storage here that it shows SqlLite. So you can drag this onto the canvas, and you can use it for one of those nodes for multiples, or you'll see here I've done selected multiple of these database nodes because they're doing different processes, and I wanted different output results. And I'm going to show you that, and we'll walk through that. All right. So the first thing we need to take a look at is when we build these SqlLite is we need to create the database. And in order to create the database or do anything really through this SqlLite node is they use a concept within Node-RED that instead of passing information on the payload, in order to do queries, inserts, gets, SQL, selects, that you need to specify all that information on the topic line. And so the first thing we had is I needed to create the table, which I'm going to call a MAC table, which I'm then inserting basically a column called ID with an integer value, which will be the primary key. And so each insert that I insert into this database with a null value is going to auto-generate a ID for me based on the row's ID. The next column is OUI of a text field with not null. Nothing should be null here for vendor or OUI. And then vendor column as well. So once we have created that inject node, which you can just drag, copy that into the topic, type it in, you then can pipe that into this SqlLite node, and it will basically create the database for you. Right? Now, the other part of that is once I had this database created, I wanted to be able to take my processed OUI, and I need to create a custom process, and this probably will be video 4 or 5 or so, but have the ability that I'm going to set up a custom schedule that this will go out and check the file, check the dates, and do everything necessary to process it to make it available in this database. So that might mean during maintenance windows, go ahead and create this database again, drop it, create it, and import it, and do all of that in that small window. Okay. And so there's a couple of things I introduced with this. The first is I'm just going to run an inject that just passes at a timestamp, but I have a function node where I don't really need this, but I think I'm programmatically going to process these OUI files maybe based on input. So I might have a reason that somebody will select a different type file, but for now I'm going to hard code this, and so I use the function not knowing any different. And I didn't want to hard code, so I put it here in the function. But you can set that same information on the file name here, right? But the key part of this is that this file node is going to read every line that I have in that file, and it's going to generate an output message, and the payload of that output message is going to be the string of the file. So that line, which is going to represent OU and vendor. And then it's going to import that data into this node and just generate the debug. And I did that earlier. I don't want to run it again because it takes a few minutes. But it does create the database. So once we have that information, we can quickly test it. And again, using the message topic, we can inject a SQL select, which tells it to pull out the OUI, comma, vendor from MAC table. And then we need to make sure the OUI is double quoted because it is a string in terms of SQL. Not an object, is a string here. So by injecting that, we can then query our database, which will then show us a result that, hey, the MAC's there, the OUI is there, and looks good. So our test should have resulted in Apple. It did, and so we're good to move forward. Now, the next part of this project, and the next part of this was, I have this database, and now I wanted to query this database using some type of consumer, whether PowerShell or Bash or some type of invoke or get or whatever it is. And I'm going to demonstrate this through the web using just a standard get with parameters. And so the first part was to do a single MAC address and a single vendor. And so I'm going to call this /getMac. And for our multiple MAC addresses, well, guess I'm going to do Macs. So I'm going to pluralize it. Probably not the best way, but I'm doing it in this case for the example. Now, what I am further doing is, again, I'm using functions to do this, where you can most likely, use the standard change nodes and do all of this through the standard nodes. But I need to get to the bottom line of the code, so I do this way to learn. And so I'm going to basically pull out those get parameters. So the URL coming in with the get parameter for the MAC and vendor, I'm going to pull out. I want to test it, and then I'm going to convert it to uppercase so that I can then pass that into a string, which I'm going to create a topic that's going to be unique to the MAC or the vendor. So in this single get, I'm going to be able to specify that the MAC equals or the vendor equals, and it will run 2 different queries based on this message topic being different for each of the input. And furthermore, it'll just output it to the response, which we expect to come out into a payload, which will be a JSON string, which will be effectively an API endpoint. And so I'm going to deploy that just to make sure everything's running. And so to test that, that's it for the API. That's all we need. And then to test that, like I have here with the Mac vendor, I can tell it what the vendor is as well. So I have the Mac or I have the vendor. And if we say Apple, it'll effectively return all of the MAC addresses for that vendor. So if you were processing that, hey, I've got this Apple, I need to know all of the Macs because I've got so many different devices, you're going to have to compare these if you're trying to track, which Mac is to what vendor. So this gives us that ability. If I need to pull them all for some type of filter rules that I need to process through script, do it this way. And it turned out to be a great thing to do. And then we could further, pull this up, and I might say, Dell. And then we could even just go in and run that example again and say that we're going to pull out just one specific Mac and then do the Mac parameter on the get line. Okay. And then that pulls up here Dell. So we've effectively turned this OUI file into a API endpoint that now a user could just simply say, if I need to know mine, or I run a simple script, or I need to know the vendor, I can call that single, and it'll upload that data and return all the JSON necessary for the string. So that turned out to work really well. And so I thought, well, it only took me 20 minutes or so when I was constructing this, once I figured out the database components. That did take a while last night. Yeah, but I did all this, again, just for reference, about 6 hours in the evening and this morning when I followed back up, just for, your time's sake. So I started thinking, well, that's great for one, but now I want to go back to my PowerShell example, and I want to do the same example with the PowerShell. That I want to be able to parse out anywhere in my environment a whole bunch of MAC addresses. I want the PowerShell to convert the MAC and strip out just the 6 bytes that I need to compare the MAC address, and upload all of that into an array, into this web service, have the web service API, the get MACs, now process each of those, query each of those, extract out the results, and join it all together and pass it all back as a result based on the uploaded data. So that got kind of complex, because I'm thinking, how do I, as I'm taking these messages, how do I construct this topic which is unique to each individual message that you need to pass, which is how SqlLite uses it, because I'm not familiar with how to do the prepared statements or anything yet, so I'm still learning this piece. And so I figured, okay, I've got to figure out some way to do the message. So here's what I effectively came up with, and maybe you can follow the logic here and see what I've done. All right. So the first thing to note is when I do this get max and I post this information into the get max, I'm passing in an array of a max JSON object. That information, when it gets passed in, also has 2 parameters that are built in from the web flow, or from the web interface in the API. And those are effectively the message.res and message.rec. So response and request. The request, the packet coming in, and then it constructs a response that matches that input and generates that to the output to match the request. Now the challenge with this is, when I first started this process, I just naturally thought, well, just let the whole payload pass all the way through the process and it'll be fine when it gets to the end. Not. And I found that I couldn't join those messages easily, and it was sending only one of the arrays out at a time, because it would send out one of the rows in the response, and it would send it to the response, and the response would end at that point. It would say, no, you can't do this anymore, the response is over. So what I effectively had to do is this. I had to, on the input of it, remove the response and the request, and I moved it into a flow. And in the flow, then, once I've moved those, and they're no longer in the packet there, I then am using a function node to query out the length of the MAC counts. So there's a max array within the payload that has a length of arrays, and it could be 1 MAC or 1,000 MACs. So I'm going to take a look at the count for comparison in my loops. I'm then going to compare what the count is that I need to check, because my for loop is only going to do max length, and it's not going to capture the length of the MAC where we want to trigger the end message. And I'm going to come down to that. So I set up a counter that say it's going to be one less of the length of the MAC in this case. And then I grab the max, created an array variable called max, and then set the max to the payload max. So now it should go out and look at that payload object dot max and import that array. So it's created the max array. So now I'm going to create a variable called m, but I'm create a loop that's going to walk through the max length. So as an example, if I have 10 MAC addresses and I start with 0, I'm going to go 10 in length, which means I'm going to end at 9. So this is going to say it's going to stop at 9, but 9 is the last one we have in the message, right? So in this for, what we're going to do is I'm going to construct and found that I needed to construct a new message. Instead of cloning the original message or copying it, I needed a new message. So I went ahead and created a new variable with a new message and opened it up with a blank curly brackets. I then compared the counter. So as I'm running through this loop, if the counter is equal to 1 minus the length, which means it's our very last packet or very last MAC in the list, then I'm going to set up a MAC, pull out the current. I'm going to create the string that's going to insert into the topic. This is now our query, select OUI, comma vendor from MAC table where OUI equals double quote, the current MAC, and double quote. Now, because this is the last message and the way that join works, which we're going to see in a little, I then tell that the message packet or the message structure here that this is the last message. So by putting message.complete equals true or to any value, it instructs the join node, this is the last message, whatever you've collected so far, send it out as an array or whatever you've constructed into the next payload, right? Now this is where I got into a lot of different ways of trying to figure out processing of how these nodes and sending messages and such. And normally I had dealt with this in a way that I was just a single message payload and or multiple messages that were being split and handling this, but having to deal with this where I was building topics, I found that I had to construct the node send function in the loop while I was creating the topic in order for this to work properly, so that it would send a new message each time. And so, as this is running through the loop, as it's in the valid counter, you'll see it's just creating the topic and sending the message. But in the last one, it sends a complete to instruct it that it's done. Okay. Now it's piping that into this SqlLite, which is again just a copy of all of these others. They're the same thing. And I could probably do different input outputs, but I wanted to process different outputs. So I separated those. And then here's the join. So I found that in the join, we're going to combine the payload, which in the case of this particular response, the payload is an array. So it's effectively going to aggregate the arrays of the payload into a single array. And as you'll see here, that when it sees this message complete, it knows that that's the last element in the array, and it sends it off to the next node. Now here's where I needed to get some tricky functionality back into this. So I had removed the request and I'd removed the response values from the payload and actually from the message. So they're no longer existing. So I had to basically move them back into the message in order for this to work properly with the output HTTP response. So instead of copying or anything, I'm just doing it for the flow. I'm moving it from flow res back into message res, and then flow rec back into there. And then the last thing I did, just to clean it up, is there was still a topic in the very last message, so I'm deleting it just to remove it, since it's not applicable to our output. And in the response here, I'm capturing this back into our response, which is going to our endpoint, consuming it, and should complete the request for everything they need. So while that looks really simple, it took me a few hours to really get this part where I had, understanding how to deal with the response and the request, and then how to join it. So you see here, I don't have a split, but by sending the individual messages and then following up the complete message, I can tell it, here's a good way to join this and go ahead and complete that. And so effectively, what we then have, if we were to look at this in terms of bash and how we might want to process this in a shell. And because we've been doing this in curl, I figured I'd go ahead and show you here. So the first part of this is curl. If I wanted to duplicate this, where we want to specify that we want to do this silently, we don't need to see the counters for the download. The -K to bypass the self sign. All right, so there's a couple of things in PowerShell we had to do as well. Because this is running, the node is running on an SSL port, we had to do some additional bypass of the self sign checks. So we need to go over that a couple of times. The -X to tell it to post, and then the headers, I'm going to tell it that the content type is JSON, which is a structure we have, and that we accept JSON. And then I had to build the -data, which will be the body that we're passing with the open curly bracket, and I'm creating an array, an array of max. So the max is the object type name, and the array opens. And I had basically created this through a script to like cut and paste this. And then lastly, my endpoint tells it where I'm going to post that information when I run this. So if I do this, which should be okay to do, we should get, as you see, a bunch of MACs. And you'll notice here as well, we see a bunch of empty information for the MAC addresses we couldn't find, because those are listed. There are some broadcast and locally administered addresses and so on. And we could then, of course, go through JQ again and pipe this out to something a little bit more readable in terms of this. Okay, so that was a real quick curl to do that. And then I needed something in PowerShell, so I went back into PowerShell and I took one of my my last example of the single vendor, and I basically constructed a get MAC vendors. So again, our plural of vendor. I should probably say something else. But this is then just going to accept a MAC search string, which is an array. And again, either 0 or 1 element or more. Now, because again, I had to connect to this on an SSL port, and PowerShell, you have to bypass the security to support insecure tokens or insecure certificates there, self-sign. I had to bypass it. So our add type, and if you just kind of take a look at that, it's the same in all of my scripts. So you can use that as you need to when you're invoking the web method to, in that session, bypass that security check. And also you need to make sure you have the all protocols all the way down to the endpoints here as well. Now you could also, of course, strip this out if you're only doing TLS, maybe TLS 1, 2. If you're not doing SSL at all, just pull it all out. But this is SSL 3 for security purposes. Now the next line here, we're constructing our headers, because again, this is a web request and we're passing JSON, we accept JSON. And then I'm effectively going out and verifying that our MAC search count is greater than 0, that we have something there, or just exit out. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the array type OUI search that we're going to use to capture each of the individual MAC address strings that we're going to create the double quotes around, because my process file doesn't have double quotes. It had MAC addresses, and I needed to go out and parse this and further do some things with the string. So we're going to, then at this point, read through our array, which is being passed in MAC search, and we're going to create a underscore MAC as the MAC address that we're processing currently. And then our next couple lines here are going to process that MAC address, replacing any colons or hyphens with 0 space, so null space, and only taking the first 6 bytes and converting that to, of course, over here, upper string, uppercase, so that it matches the data that we're trying to query through the string, because that's stored in uppercase as well. And lastly, here in the OUI search, the plus equals just tells it to append it to the array instead of just a string. And then I had to put double quotes around the string, so it's 4 double quotes to a double quote, plus your MAC search string, which in this case is constructed with 6 bytes, plus the 4 closing quotes to equal a double quote. And then because I needed the array to have a new line, I did a dash, which is actually a backtick. So it's double quote, backtick in double quote to get a new line, which will build the array in a readable list. And then lastly, when it were processed, it was joining the search with a comma, because we need this JSON structure to be comma separated in our input. And then lastly, I just went ahead and did it like I had in my others, a wrapper with a max, telling it to wrap around the join search. And then we went ahead, and I probably duplicated this Yeah, I sure did. I'm going to go ahead and remove these while I'm at it. And then lastly, we have our results. Now, I probably want to, and you do as well, wrap this in a try so we can capture any errors and things. But I'm just doing this real quick to demonstrate the example. And then in this, we're going to invoke our REST method, telling it the URI, which is the getMax endpoint within Node-RED, headers and the method post. Our OUI body is this structure, and our content type is application JSON, and we're just going to write out the output. And so therefore, your get Mac vendors with that Mac input is just that. It's effectively comes back in less than a second, and wherein our other search, let's go ahead and run it again, took 30, 40 seconds. So I think now we have a really good solution for having a get Mac lookup that engineers can copy to their local PCs on their Linux or on their Windows, run it in PowerShell, have it go out and get the file, have it go out and do the checks, and then have it read that information into this process, which will then go out and compare the MAC addresses, process it, and do everything local. But when you're looking for performance, and if you can, and you're on your local intranet or enterprise, that you can go out and actually tell it to upload this data, have it process at the server level, doing the SQL queries, respond everything back. Once we can do that, then you have a pretty powerful process, and it's very quick at that time. So it looks like this is going to download another version here, and I'm going to give this a second and let it come back here. But that's what we're looking at. So one second. Okay, I want to run this through here. I've had a little bit of problem with the internet here lately, and some things externally querying. So I wanted to reset this just to see what's happening. It might just be a connection string or something's going on with my device connecting to the internet. Seems real slow. All right, but I'm going to give this a few minutes, just let you know what I'm doing here and see if it completes. And if it does, then I'm going to take a look at it. Maybe they blacklisted me from doing this video. Hang on, I'll be right back. Well, hi everybody. I'm not sure what happened there, but I'll tell you what I did do. For whatever reason, the web request method was not working well, so I went ahead and changed it to the Invoke-Restmethod and set it up as a method get in our OUI file, the out file, and also changed it in the second area that we check it by the date if it's processor as well. So I did have to change that to REST method, which seemed to work and actually ran much faster. So again, just so remember what this was. The idea was that it was running here and searching things locally, and everything was okay. And speed wasn't too bad in that particular case. But when we were doing this through Macs and then trying to import the different MAC addresses, because this is where it's going to pull out. Each line has to be queried versus having to go out and pull out just one vendor, because that's real easy to do. And then what we had was a MAC input. Let me see if I still have my MAC input. If not, we'll get it. Okay. And let's do this. Let's go ahead and copy our art back out there, recreate this, and let's call this MAC input. And our MAC input now should have that, and we should then be able to do get MAC vendor. We're going to assume the defaults, and this is going to read the file. And this is where I was saying the time. So this is as it's processing each line, has to do a query against this. This is where the slowdown is. The vendor doesn't seem to be an issue, but this is where the slowdown is in the MAC lookup. And then our result is, because we now created this new get vendors that we're using here, to pull out and get the MAC addresses to do that detail. And because we're doing that, we should be able to do that in a much quicker way. Oh, I haven't imported it. I apologize. So let me do my import again. Okay. One more time with a search. And then MAC vendors with the MAC input. And there you go. So that's it, folks. That's what I wanted to share with you and where I was as of today. And building this into the Node-RED, where we're having the workflow and having this ability to do it through API. So bulk uploads, bulk checks, that's pretty neat. And I think if we can build this into files as another example where we can upload a file of data to again parse it out or something along those lines. Now for the PowerShell enthusiast, before I get off the line here and start looking at the other videos, I did discover I was trying to run some commands on my Linux host where I have the PowerShell installed, and I had built out some standard shell scripts. And I wanted you to see what it took to run that, because there is a way to do it. You basically in your PowerShell pass a command, and then you pipe in your script name, and that should allow you to run this in the background, so you can execute a node or use and integrate PowerShell with your Linux or Windows or wherever you're running the Node-RED and utilize the underlying shell capabilities. So I started down that path, and I'm going to go back and revisit this again, but maybe in another video. But there you go. I hope that is interesting to somebody and that you might have and see where this could be of value, and we're going to kind of build on top of it still. And I think work on the next one, the vendors. We'll look at some upload files. And where I really want to go to, and this is going to be one of the videos down the line, is I want to interface this with IP control now, or at some point where I can export IP addresses that have MAC addresses and then have it look up the MAC and add that back into the data if it's not there, or just kind of print it out, add it to the device object when it exports it. So I'm going to have some interesting things to look at. I'll have to figure out the best way. Anyway, that's a kind of a long video this morning, and probably the only one I'll do today. And I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow or the next day. Take care.